Hello and welcome. Today we're going to take a look at secretless authentication using token exchange. The RFC 7523 is a specification that defines the use of a JWT bearer token as a means for requesting an OAuth 2.0 access token as well as for client authentication. This is a demonstration to showcase using JWTs for client authentication to enable authentication without sharing a secret. It is built around Azure, but the client, Azure DevOps in this case, and the authorization server, Entra in this case, could just as easily be other services. In this case, we have the client, Azure DevOps. We have the client token issuer, that's also Azure DevOps in our case, the authorization server, that's Entra, and we have the API. In our case, we'll be using Microsoft Graph. The first thing that we do is we run a pipeline in Azure DevOps, and we request the client JWT. And through Azure DevOps and whatever it does in the background, we receive this token. We then take this token and send it to the authorization server, Entra in our case. Entra will validate the client JWT with the token issuer and make sure that it's valid. If it's valid, we will be issued a new access token from Entra. And using this access token, we can send a request to the API, Microsoft Graph in this case, and Microsoft Graph will validate the access token with Entra, and if it's valid, we will receive a response from Microsoft Graph. Now let's try and set it up and see how it goes. The first thing we need is an Azure DevOps organization, which I already have set up. We need to create a project. Let's call this demo project and create it. We need to store the name of the project or the organization. I'll just copy it from here, store it like that. Then we need to find out the organization ID. And we do that using this URI. And if we go to instance ID, we can copy it from there. And we need to store it with this name for later use. Then we need to store the project name as well, demo project. Then we need to create a repository to use. In this case, I won't be using the default. I will create a new one. Let's call that demo repo. When we've stored all of these parameters, we can now go to the authorization server, Entra, and store a few of the parameters for that as well. We need the Entra ID or Entra tenant ID. And get that from overview and just copy that. Then we need to create the client application, store the client ID. Let's call this demo repo and copy the client ID. When we have all of these things, we can then create the federated credentials. The federated credentials is created in the application. Go to certificates and secrets, then federated credentials. Here you can click add credential and then choose other issuer. Now enter the issuer URL and copy the DevOps organization ID and replace that. Then we need to take the subject identifier like this and replace different parts. We need to take the organization name, replace it again. Then we need to take the project name, and then the repository name. After that, you can call it just about whatever you want. In my case, I named it like this. And the audience can be left as default. Now we can set up an Azure pipeline. I've already created one, so let's go through it before we run it. First, we have 3 parameters: the Entra tenant ID, the Entra client ID, and print tokens. The tenant ID, client ID will be pasted when we run the pipeline, and print tokens is a boolean to say if we want to print the JWTs or not. The first step is extracting the Azure DevOps JWT. We do that using curl, and we leverage the system OIDC request URI, where we append the API version. We also use the system.accessToken secret variable in Azure DevOps, and we use JQ to extract the OIDC token from the JSON response. We then store it as Azure DevOps JWT and store it as a variable. After that, we run the next step, and that's extracting the Entra JWT. We send a request to Entra, and we use the Entra tenant ID, and we use the grant type client credentials with the client ID that we inserted as a parameter. And then we use the client assertion type JWT bearer and the scope graph. And as the last step here, we insert the client assertion with the Azure DevOps JWT. If we get a successful response from here, we extract the access token. And then we store the access token as the Entra JWT. And the last step here is to send a request to Microsoft Graph with the Entra JWT. And if everything works successfully, we should be able to see some information about the current client ID. So let's try it out. We create a pipeline and we save it. Then run the pipeline, and we need to insert the tenant ID as well as the client ID. And we will print the tokens for debugging. And now, when it's finished, we should be able to see that it has successfully extracted an Azure DevOps JWT. You can copy this and paste it into jwt.ms. And here we can see the subject that we inserted into the federated credentials in Entra, and the audience, as well as the organization ID and the issuer. Then we can take a look at the Entra JWT, and we have the audience for Microsoft Graph here. And the last step should be the graph response. Anyway, we can see a successful graph response. And to recap, we have, using Azure DevOps, requested a client JWT and received it. We've sent this client JWT to Entra, and Entra have validated it using the client token issuer from Azure DevOps and issued an access token for us to use. We've then taken this access token sent it to the API, Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph have validated the access token with Entra and then sent us a response. This can be done using other services than Azure DevOps and Entra. We could also use managed service identity in Azure. We can use this with AWS and GCP as well. That's it for today, and thank you for watching.